C-SPAN 2, and watch any of our past programs online at booktv.org. Book TV continues now with Caroline Fredrickson. The author of Under the Bus discusses the impact of labor and employment laws on working women and their families on our Afterwards program.
Well, hi, Caroline Fredrickson. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to talk about your new book, Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over. It is a pretty bold thesis, a pretty provocative title. So I think we'll just jump right into it, and I'll give you a minute to tell us what you mean by this.
Great, sure. Sabrina, well, first let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here with you and on C-SPAN. So the book, it came out of I guess my disappointment, really, with some of the dialogue that occurred after Sheryl Sandberg published her book, Lean In, which I think says some important things. But there are a lot of things that weren't said that really are what affect the vast majority of women, for whom leaning in isn't really, an available option. Their challenges are much more existential. And so what I wanted to do was expose some of the broader questions that are affecting women in the workforce, and think about what are the possible solutions that we as a nation could be moving towards.
Right. Well, yeah, I was going to say that it did seem like part of your frustration was simply about the conversation around working women and which working women we're talking about. So this book really focuses on women with less education who are sort of lower down on the socioeconomic ladder. Obviously, you have a legal and policy background. You're familiar with the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Family and Medical Leave Act. But the premise seems to be that none of these laws really go far enough, that we simply need more government to help women, especially those who are lower on the economic scale. Do you want to sort of share more about that?
Well, sure. Sabrina, I think there are two pieces to it. One is that we simply don't have responses to some very broad questions. And these aren't just for low-wage women, although they're particularly important for them. But, for example, we don't actually have a child care system in this country. We have some Band-Aids. We have some subsidized programs that are very under-resourced. Only 18% of eligible children are actually able to get in to the government-subsidized programs. But then middle-class families struggle very deeply with the costs of child care. And you hear that child care, actual quality child care, can cost as much as tuition at a university. So, we have that is really out of whack. But then, what was really interesting and somewhat troubling to me, coming out of a background of policy and law, was that as I started looking into some of the laws that I've found and believed to be very important, and still do, that they had some real gaps in there. And as I looked into them and looked into the history, I realized, and that's sort of where this title comes from, that in the deal-making process, there were categories of workers, and a lot of them were women and women of color, who got thrown under the bus. And so they were cut out, or explicitly left out of our wage and hour laws, or who don't have the right to organize in a union, or who may not be covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act. And these are, I think we don't look enough at the gaps and think about what the impact is. And so, I started thinking about, as I got deeper into this issue and started thinking about the domestic workers who basically have no legal protections in the workplace. And I started wondering, well, so for a nanny who doesn't get paid or is not at least guaranteed a minimum wage or overtime, isn't protected against discrimination, certainly can't join a union, what happens when the nanny has a sick kid? What goes on in that situation? And so it was questions like that I wanted to explore. What is the child care situation for someone in that category? And as I looked more and more into it, as I said, I got into all these other issues of family leave and child care, and discovered somewhat, even more to my dismay, that the Department of Labor does surveys of the kind of care that children are in. They actually have a category that is quite large. It's called self-care. And those are the kids who are just left. They're just left by themselves. And I think that, for me, even if you don't, no matter what your perspective is on working women, or whether or not we need a strong government role in providing a fair workplace, the fact that we have a large group of children who are growing up without supervision, I think, is an economic issue for all of us, because the consequences of that are lasting.
Well, one of the things that you have right in the book jacket, actually, is that a lot of these women, as you see it, and then we'll get into the policies, the specific policies in a minute, but that they're sort of really systematically left out. Do you think that policymakers are overtly eliminating them, or they're saying we don't need to worry about those women? I mean, is that really, are they really that bad? I mean,
well, you know, honestly, not anymore. It doesn't play out that way. Now it's more inadvertent or questions of the costs. But at its origins, it was actually quite explicit. And when I was digging into some of the history around the New Deal, and when Congress adopted the sort of the flagship pieces of legislation, the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act, there's some very explicit conversations on the record coming from Southern, what we would call Dixiecrats, who reflected a very strong point of view about the Southern economy being dependent on the kind of agricultural farming that the farm economy that was dominant in the South, and they wanted to protect what they thought of as their way of life. And again, it's very explicit in talking about how important it is for us to keep, you know, our traditions, and the black man, you know, can't be paid the same as the white man because that's not what we do. And so you have these conversations on the record, and then you had actions that sort of, in terms of the implementation, where categories of workers who were, it was well known, were African American, and many of them were women. They were the domestic workers and the farm workers, and a lot of the farm laborers were women as well. And they were cut out as in a concession to the Dixiecrats, who wanted to preserve their economy as well as the dominance of the white majority down there.
Right, and certainly I think we'd both agree that 80 plus years later, hopefully things have evolved, you know, in many ways, in many good ways. But at the same time, you of course point very quickly in the book to the pay gap. The idea that women are still only paid, or I should say white women are still only paid 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. Now, and you know, it's funny because this conversation happens all the time. We just had Equal Pay Day here in Washington, sort of the date that lots of women's groups say marks the amount of time extra that women would have to work to make up for those lost wages. But at the same time, we're seeing that more and more mainstream and even left-leaning outlets are questioning this number, right? That we're saying, okay, there is a wage gap, but it's not quite as large. Do you think it's fair to keep using this number? Should we be using a different number? Are we able to convince people that we need policy if we use a smaller number? Is that the problem?
Well, you know, I do think it's a fair number, but I would agree with those who are critical who'd say it's not all a reflection of discrimination. Okay. At least explicit, direct discrimination.
And social. So,
you know, economists, you know, say there's somewhere between around a 20% pay gap. About 49–50% of that is attributable to occupational segregation. And I think we could have an argument about whether that is a choice or whether there are cultural constraints or it's difficult for women to break into different professions. But it is a
viewers
fact.
What you mean by that, because some people refer to it as the pink ghetto. Others probably talk about this occupational segregation. But
sure. You know, what's interesting is that you know, 1/5 of women workers are in 5 jobs, 5 job categories. So you're talking secretary, child care, child teachers, and so forth. And those kind of jobs are dominated by women. And so there's definitely, they're lower paid than a lot of the categories of jobs that are dominated by men. Now, there is a question, and this is where there may be some disagreement between women's groups and other groups. But many women's groups would assert, and I would agree with them, that because these jobs are dominated by women doesn't mean they should be paid less. When you look at jobs of equivalent skill, experience, and so forth, it doesn't make sense that the jobs that are dominated by men should be paid more. So even if you say that part of the pay gap is due to occupational segregation, that is, women go into certain career paths that are lower paid, I think there's a question about why they are lower paid. And I think it's a reflection of a broader sort of set of constraints on the roles of women and the expectations of their ability to earn money, whether or not a caregiving role should be as valued as a role where, you know, a man is driving a truck.
Right.
And I think perhaps somewhat of an expectation that because women are sort of innately caregivers, that they're doing it as a job gets discounted because it's kind of what they are and what their nature is.
Okay, fair. I mean, fair enough. Of course, I think some people would say that people, you know, men and women are different and that we have different preferences and aptitudes and strengths, and so women may choose to go into certain jobs that give them that sort of more comfortable or come naturally to them. And of course, I would think that there are also some benefits to this segregation, right, in some ways, right? So we know that men die more frequently on the job. Is that in somehow sort of reverse discrimination? Are we allowing men to do jobs that are, you know, more dangerous than women? Is that a problem?
Well,
or?
you know, I would be more than happy to see more men school teachers if they want to be school teachers. And I think actually it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for our society to have more diversity in terms of which, you know, whether men or women fill different roles. I think it's hard. I think it's hard for women to move into professions that are dominated by men for a lot of reasons. You know, some of it is internal. Going back to Sheryl Sandberg, I think we impose some constraints on ourselves, which may be from the broader culture, but we don't want to be unladylike. Driving a truck is not what a lot of women do. But then, you know, I think there are plenty of examples of the hostility and harassment that women can face in those kinds of job sectors. But I fully agree. I think choice is the operative. People should have the liberty to be in the kind of profession they want. And that's all I'm interested in looking at, really, is how do we dismantle barriers if they shouldn't be there? If women want to be school teachers, I think that's terrific. But I do think we should pay school teachers adequately, and they should be paid at the level that is commensurate with the skills and experience they have.
Right. No, and I think this is so interesting because you do mention that you think that women are still met with hostility and disapproval when they move into these more male-dominated fields. And I was thinking about this, and of course, you and I live in Washington. It would be hard, you know, I'm hard-pressed to say that there's no discrimination or sexism here in D.C. But I also wonder, you know, is society and is this part of society still backwards? Are they still sort of that sexist, or is it much worse? Is it more pronounced in these fields than, say, in more elite fields, in law or medicine, veterinary care, where we're seeing women excel? Do you think it's worse at this part of the socioeconomic ladder?
Well, I don't really have the data on that, but I do think that's certainly where some of the most egregious examples come from.
Right.
And I think it may be that the segregation in terms of gender is most extreme there, and those are the jobs that tend to be most associated with kind of machismo or masculinity. So I don't want to make too broad of a conclusion, but I certainly think there are difficulties for women in those professions, and I really think it's wonderful that there's some organizations that try and break down those barriers and offer women training. I mean, those are good paying jobs, and so being a welder may be something that would be great for certain women because it pays a decent wage and they can raise their family on it, and the door shouldn't be closed to them because their colleagues might really not want them there.
Right, and of course some women are looking for professions that give them more flexibility. Certainly the restaurant industry, service industry is an area where a lot of times women are able to create their own hours. But I wonder if there's some lessons that we should take away from sort of white-collar jobs. I remember reading about Walmart's flexible work arrangements for its legal department and how that sort of trickled down into other areas. Do you think that there's room for that kind of, it worked here for more educated women or for higher skilled jobs? Can it work in lower skilled jobs too?
Sabrina, it's a great question. And, you really make me think of, one of the facts that I guess it's not that surprising in retrospect, but seemed surprising when I was doing the research, was how much more accessible flexible schedules are to white-collar workers, and that higher-earning workers, and men particularly, are the ones who have most access to family leave and sick leave. and vacation days. And I think you point out that they also have more flexible schedules just generally. I mean, I think the way our Fair Labor Standards Act works is that if you're a salaried employee, you don't punch a clock if you have to run out for a dentist appointment in the middle of the day.
Right.
You don't account for that hour and a half by working an extra hour and a half another time. Although people understand you probably will.
Right.
But that kind of ability to kind of deal with daily circumstances, and I'm just thinking about, I was thinking about that on the way here. About all of the snow days that we had in the D.C. area. And for people who work, and I know this is now becoming less of a mother's issue, but also a father's issue, the mothers and fathers who were struggling to try and figure out who, if the school was closed, who would be able to stay home and who would go to work. But, a lot of white-collar folks were able to telecommute or come in late. And if you're an hourly worker, if you're working at McDonald's, that's just not an option for you. And so I think it's a good point. And I actually have seen data that shows that flexible work hours actually increase productivity. That ultimately, for the economy, you have lower job turnover, so that you have greater experience and the workers who stay, and you don't have the costs that are associated with recruiting and training somebody new. So I think it's definitely something that we should try and push down, because I think those of us who've been lucky enough to benefit from education and a socioeconomic class that has allowed us to be lawyers and doctors and whatever, have by and large been able to take advantage of those circumstances when we have a family crisis or when there's a snow day or whatever reason you might need some flexibility in your job.
Of course, and it seems as though, where we talk about flexibility and flexible hours for some of those white-collar jobs, that actually shared jobs is an area where I think we could see a lot of real progress for service industry, right? That you don't need the same person to do the job all week long, but people, especially women, who maybe want to pick up extra hours here and there, that they really would benefit from those kind of workplace policies that we'll hopefully see more of.
No, absolutely. And I think there's some interesting examples in other countries. I think Prime Minister Cameron was a big proponent of flexible work hours in England. And, one of the things that they did was to guarantee that men and women who wanted to propose, maybe a short work week of, 4 or 10-hour days, or different configurations, come in late, and leave late, or some other option, or a job sharing, could make a proposal, and the employer actually would have to accept it unless there was some business reason why they couldn't, some economic impact on the company. But if it was just a matter of rearranging some responsibilities that didn't have a major impact, they actually had to go forward and implement that. And I think that is just a wonderful approach. The other thing I think that is we need to consider is, on the flip side of that, we have situations in the retail and restaurant industries where people don't know their schedules until the day of or maybe the day before. And so they call in and they're told, sorry, you don't have a shift today, or yes, you're working a double shift. And all of a sudden they either have to find childcare or they don't have work that day, meaning they earn less money, which means they might not be able to afford childcare for the next time they have to be at work. And that kind of complete lack of control over the schedule is, I think, hard enough for most people. Anyone who's worked in a law firm and been there on a Friday afternoon when the partner comes and dumps a task on your desk and says, this is for Monday morning, understands the loss of control of your schedule. But for these low-wage workers who are sort of in an everyday roller coaster of not knowing whether they're working or not working, and that means they don't know whether they're how to deal with childcare, other responsibilities, and certainly whether they don't know how much they're going to be earning for any work period.
Well, certainly, maybe we should shift into what some of the solutions are. I gather from what you were saying a moment ago that you do favor, and you certainly talk about it in the book, more top-down, one-size-fits-all policies that would blanket a larger group of people, because this feeling is that more people have been left out. So you point to, and you've worked on the issue of the Paycheck Fairness Act, for instance, as a way of hopefully closing the remaining wage gap, whatever it may be. Do you worry, certainly some critics would say that a law like that makes women sort of a liability, that it in effect makes them more expensive to hire, that employers see women now as a potential lawsuit, and that if there was a man who is equally qualified, well, maybe that's the safer route. Do you worry about that with something like the PFA?
I don't actually. I mean, we've had Title VII on the books and the Equal Pay Act since the early 60s, and I don't think they have resulted in an impact where women have been, employers have been less willing to hire women, minorities, religious minorities, the disabled, and so forth. They've actually been a necessary response because those groups were actually not being hired or not being promoted or not being paid fairly. The Paycheck Fairness Act is really designed to close some gaps and strengthen the enforcement mechanisms. The Equal Pay Act doesn't have much in the way of damages, so it's really kind of a weak, it's sort of a limp noodle of a statute. The idea with the Paycheck Fairness Act was both to strengthen the enforcement, provide a stronger leverage for the EEOC, for the enforcement organizations to get employers to actually pay women a fair wage, and as well as to move towards transparency in terms of salaries, which is a very important piece. I think a lot of people don't know that there are significant numbers of employees who are told by their employers that they are not allowed to, either by contract or by the order of the boss, that they're not allowed to share their salary information with their colleagues. And that, I can understand why employers want to do that. On the other hand, it makes it very difficult for women, for minorities to ever understand where they stand in terms of salaries with respect to their colleagues. And I think, the case of Lilly Ledbetter, which is quite famous, she brought her case to the Supreme Court, is telling. She worked for her employer for several decades, and it was only as she was getting close to her retirement that she was slipped a note by somebody. Was this, she didn't know where it came from, that said, "You've been paid 40% less than the guys for your entire career." And it was shocking to her. I mean, she had made it in Goodyear, was one of the few women at her level, had endured a very unpleasant workplace, harassment, a boss who told her that he really didn't want women in the workplace, certainly not in those positions. Right. And then to find out at the end of the day that she has been discriminated against so significantly. And she went to the Supreme Court, and she lost there because of what I think was an inappropriate reading of the statute of limitations. The Supreme Court, the conservative majority, basically said that she should have complained when she was first discriminated against, which was when she was hired in her first paycheck. The fact of the matter, it wasn't until decades later that she actually knew that she'd been discriminated against because the employer actually had imposed this kind of secrecy on salaries. Congress then ended up reinforcing what it originally meant, which is discrimination, and she should have been able to make a claim. But by then, she had lost because the law didn't get changed till after her case went to the Supreme Court. And she was out not only all those wages, but she was out the retirement, which was significantly she was significantly underpaid in terms of her retirement because it was based on her salary.
Right. No, and certainly discrimination exists. Independent Women's Forum did some research a few years ago, and we found that 74% of women think discrimination is at least somewhat of a problem. So everyone has a story. That doesn't necessarily mean that they believe it's sort of widespread, but everyone knows it exists. And of course, then we have this issue of privacy and wanting to balance that with transparency. I'm wondering, a couple of things come to mind. One is the best thing for women not more laws perhaps, but just a growing economy, more jobs, which would then lead to wage competition? Employers would have to be more transparent. They would have to compete with other businesses out there because employees would become more valuable to them. Do we think that that is even perhaps a stronger solution?
Well, Sabrina, I definitely think a stronger economy helps low-wage workers. And there's no question, and we've seen some of the movement in wages just in the last couple of years as the economy has recovered. However, I think that doesn't really address the wage gap, and it doesn't address some of the structural issues that we have. And to go back to the domestic workers, I mean, this is a category of workers, particularly the home health aides, that is one of our most rapidly growing sectors. There's a huge demand for home health aides, but they are still carved out of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this is a category of workers who is not entitled to minimum wage or overtime, and are often expected to work just inhumane hours. They may be going between patient to patient. They have very, very difficult jobs because they're often dealing with elderly or disabled people who need to be moved, lifted, you know, clean, assisted in all sorts of ways. And yet we haven't seen, just because there's a great demand and there's certainly a huge need, wages aren't moving up. And so I think, I guess I come from, the sort of the wing of the sort of belief in the economy that, that the government actually does play a role. And I think coming out of the New Deal, we saw, some of the real significant changes that were brought about because of the workplace laws that were enacted by President Roosevelt. So I think to a great extent, the economy growing helps everybody. Right. But I think in order to sort of counteract some of these structural problems that we have, and with certain types of job categories, I think there needs to be a stronger government hand in those particular places.
And one area in particular, in addition to the Paycheck Fairness Act, is the minimum wage. In fact, you go as far as to say we don't just need an increase in the minimum wage, we need a living wage, which you said would in effect be higher than any kind of modest raise. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that, what the living wage really means and how that would impact businesses?
Yeah, and there have been a number of states and localities that have enacted living wages. In my state of Maryland, contractors with the state have to pay a living wage. And there are a lot of people who are lobbying to have changes like that pushed through the federal government. That is, if you're getting a big contract from the U.S. government, you should have to pay your workers a decent wage. And so I think, we've seen there have been, a lot of moves in the last election to raise the minimum wage across the country. A lot of states have done away with the sort of bifurcated minimum wage, which gives tipped employees a much, much lower wage. And, a state like Washington State, which is now, $15 an hour, at least in Seattle, $15 an hour, they're not seeing job losses, and they're not seeing employer flight. It's actually been good for the economy. It's good for the workers, and I think it's definitely something that we need to examine very strongly, because the minimum wage has not kept pace with overall cost of living, and it has not kept pace with the growth in the economy. And so you see, where we are now, we're well behind where we should be if the minimum wage had been actually pegged to the economy.
Well, I certainly think that there are those businesses that are able to increase their employees' wages more aggressively should be applauded. But I also am noticing sort of this trend, and especially with jobs that are sort of less skilled, the automation, right? So you go into convenience stores now, and there isn't anybody checking you out. You check yourself out, and that seems to be increasingly a consideration. And I hope, or I suppose it's worth a conversation, and we should talk about, in our efforts to micromanage wages, are we in fact going to see more women, especially, out of work altogether?
Well, it's certainly a criticism that has been raised of efforts to ensure that people get paid a decent wage. Right. But I still think the data don't bear that out, and there are a lot of job categories that are just not. You just can't mechanize a nanny. I mean, there's nothing you can do. Nobody wants to hire a robot to watch their children. At least I don't think so. At least not based on what we have right now, as well as home health aides, and the person who does your hair or your nails, or any number of categories of workers that are just not the kind that you can really do by machine. Right. So, I think around the margins there's some truth to that, but I think by and large there'll be such a benefit to low-wage workers that it's worth moving forward.
So, this raises another question, which is that we often sort of still think about, and maybe you can talk about a little bit the structure of the workplace today, because as things have changed, we see many, many more women in managerial positions and HR positions. So in theory, those women are overseeing other women. And I wonder, you know, are we, when we talk about discrimination in the workplace, are we too one-dimensional? Do we think that people are too quick to dismiss their employees? I mean, I'm thinking of it not only as someone who comes from a family with who have owned businesses, but also I run an organization. So the most frightening thing to me is somebody, you know, losing an employee, right?
I know. I'm totally with you on that. Yeah.
So are we too one-dimensional about how employers behave?
Yeah, well, no, Sabrina, I think it's a very good point. And I'm since I run an organization too, I feel entirely the same, that when you have a wonderful employee and you lose them for whatever reason, you know, we bend over backwards to keep people, make sure that we can structure a workplace that allows them to have a life outside without making you know, too many sacrifices. And so I think it's very important, and I think maybe it's a cultural shift that we need to go through, and maybe it's a cultural shift that we will go through, because, you know, here's the fact is that we have, you know, well over 3/4 of women are in the workforce. You have over 3/4 of women with children between 6 and 18 who are working, and you have 2/3 of women with children under 6 who are working, and for single moms, it's a much higher number. So I think, you know, we're in a world that we have to learn to live with. And so, you know, whether or not, I think, whatever perspective you have about whether women should work or whether it's preferable that they stay home, we have to address the facts, you know, that we have, that women are working, and it's very unlikely that we're going to go back to a situation where women don't work in such high numbers.
Right.
And so if that's the truth, and we care about the next generation and the future of our country, we're going to need to invest the resources to allow women to have work and family, and make sure that their children have the best caregiving possible.
Right. And before we even move into the issue of child care subsidies, because I know that's one that is important to you as well, the issue of paid leave. The Family and Medical Leave Act, we have that since 1993 now. But again, this is another one of those laws which it sounds like you think covers a lot of people, but it's simply not enough. Maybe you can share more about the problem of paid leave.
You know, unfortunately, the Family and Medical Leave Act, I think, was well-intentioned.
Right.
But it actually covers many fewer people than is understood. For example, only employers with over 50 employees are covered at all. And then only employees who work for those employers who've worked over 1,250 hours in the previous year. So estimates show that more than 40% of workers aren't covered at all. But even that being said, it's very hard for certain workers to take unpaid leave. Right. And so, you know, at the end of the day, you see large categories of women opting out because they can't afford it. So the consequences of that are, you know, and I've read numbers of studies that have analyzed women who've gone back to work after, you know, cesareans that were that they didn't heal from very well, after hemorrhaging, after different kinds of sickness, after difficulties of nursing. And the impact on mothers to have to go back soon is demonstrable. And then the impact on children is very significant. So, you know, unfortunately, the Family and Medical Leave Act hasn't dealt with that very much. And I think the authors of the legislation hoped that it would spur more paid leave.
Right.
But it hasn't.
From the employer, that the employers would
exactly.
then expand.
So unfortunately, the calculation is still that only 10% of American workers have paid leave. So that's very low. And you know, I think that's a really significant problem, and one that I think if we look at, you know, other developed countries, we'll see that we're really an outlier in this category.
Now, I thought the numbers were a bit higher, but I don't want to tease that out here. But I do want to get your opinion on the costs of paid leave, not only for employers, but for other employees, right? The young woman or man who doesn't have a family, who has to pick up the slack for the person who's out. I have 3 young children, so I feel like it's safe. I'm on the safe side to say that I understand tremendously the need for time off, paid time off. But at the same time, I realize that when I am out of the workplace, someone else has to do the work I'm doing. And in many of these jobs, they're very physical jobs. Do we have to consider more how those women and those men as well would be affected?
Well, so the Family and Medical Leave Act and other leave policies don't cover only childbirth. They cover early child care, which can be done by a dad. or by a partner. And they also cover other types of family medical issues, so caring for an elderly relative.
Right.
So I think, everybody has those situations, and I can understand how in certain circumstances it can be difficult, and maybe people feel like they're bearing an unfortunate amount of the workload, or an unfair amount of the workload. But I think it more or less comes out in the wash, because we all want to have that security that if we're suffering from some kind of a family emergency, a parent that's very ill, who needs us to be there, that if you need to go to your parent's bedside and they're in the hospital, you really want to be able to do that and not risk your job. And so I think it was a very important step forward, but I think there are too few workers who are either covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act, and there are certainly well too few who don't have paid leave.
Now, you mentioned one woman in the book, and this might shock, I think, some viewers. I mean, you talk about her story in which she asked for a day off, and she gets fired. And I wonder, is that the outlier? Of course, there are bad bosses out there. Of course, there are people who are just unfeeling. But most of us who oversee staff want our employees to be happy so that they are productive. Is that the outlier, or do you think that happens much more than we realize?
Well, Sabrina, one of the reasons I wanted to bring stories like that out was because they're outliers to people in sort of in our world, right? In people who work in larger organizations, people who work in professional organizations, but they're not that unusual examples for these women who work in the kind of more manual labor, whether they're in doing domestic work. But I think that is, particularly a difficult situation where they're either working to care for patients, elderly patients or disabled patients, or they're caring for children and they're in someone's household. And I think that's where many of the most poignant stories occur, and they are sort of outliers in that they're individual examples of one employer is a family, and the employee is a woman caring for their children, and so sometimes they may become more emotional or poignant than they would in the more kind of professionalized atmospheres that we work in. But what I wanted to point out to the reader was that these examples, they're things that are legal. These are things that are illegal, and that women who work in those circumstances don't actually have any protections if they're safe. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act won't cover them if they tell their employer, I'm pregnant, and think that that's great, and their employer doesn't think that's so great. They can be fired.
And how would some of the what ways would you tweak some of these laws or implement new laws to actually cover these women that fall through the cracks or who sort of are run over?
Well, so one of the things that's actually in play right now is to provide domestic workers, that category of home health aides and nannies as opposed to babysitters. So to provide them with a minimum wage and overtime protections. And this is actually, it's an interesting sort of historical issue, because originally these workers were cut out of the law, as we were talking about, because of sort of explicit racism and in interest in preserving the Jim Crow economy in the South. But then, as time went by, it became increasingly clear that there was an injustice being done. And in the 70s, the Congress finally passed legislation to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to incorporate those groups into the law. But what happened then was that the Labor Department under President Nixon issued a rule that cut them out again. And so this has been, this has been 40 years since then trying to fix that regulation. President Obama has issued a new rule that would once again try and cover these workers, and it is now being held. So I'm sure it's going to be, once it's implemented, the subject of much litigation, but I think it's a very important move forward. So one of the things that one of the things that was sort of it surprised me, thinking that I knew a lot about our employment laws, was just the categories of workers who'd been cut out, and that as we draft, so as we talked before, there was sort of a moment in time when there was really explicit misogyny and racism, and then what sort of happened is that that's the status quo, and since it's the status quo, and you've worked on the Hill and I've worked on the Hill, and when you draft legislation, you're usually looking at models, right? And when I worked on the Paycheck Fairness Act, we were looking at the Equal Pay Act. And so you sort of update, you don't generally change the whole framework of the law.
Right.
So the existing omissions were just continued on. And so I think what I don't have every solution, obviously, and I think that's for more brilliant people than me. But what I wanted to do was say that we really need to sort of go back to square one in some sense and think about what are the protections we want for workers.
Right.
And if that's our frame, what is it that we want to provide, instead of thinking, here's what the Fair Labor Standards Act does. Let's loop in one more group. Let's add in
these.
Yes.
Right. Well, it's a fair sort of assessment. And one thing that kind of comes to mind for me is that you think about how big the country is, how varied. Everybody has something different that they're looking for. Some people want higher wages. Some people want more benefits. Some people want more flexibility. And I imagine that goes up and down the economic ladder, right? And so is it possible that, as we're seeing with things like the FLSA and the Family Medical Leave Act and others, that we're somehow limiting people's choices? Are we going to make the workplace less flexible? Or again, another way of putting this is I have somebody who helps me in our house. She gave me a price of what it would cost. It seemed fair to me. It seemed appropriate. If she had gone much, much higher, I wouldn't have been able to do it. If we have more of these kind of regulations, will we find that we can't freely negotiate contracts or pricing and wages that we think work for both parties?
Well, you're appealing to the lawyer in me. There's a whole line of, this sort of the very statutes that we're talking about grew out of a time when this was the big debate, right? I mean, how can you constrain the right to contract?
Right.
And and I think that there was a big debate in the Supreme Court at the time, which struck down President Roosevelt's statutes multiple times, trying to limit the amount of child labor. But I think where I would fall is that I think there are differences in bargaining power between different groups of people, and one of the things that the statutes attempted to do was to give people who are sort of the more vulnerable workers the ability to have some leverage on their side, and that would be putting constraints on the employer. So yes, it does constrain the ability to negotiate, but in a positive way, I think, in that particularly when you're talking about individual workers, and they may be, I think a lot of cases where people are independent contractors working as house cleaners or as gardeners and so forth. They may be immigrants, and they may not speak English all that well. I think we're looking at a situation where there's an ability for the stronger party, that is the employer, to negotiate a wage that's simply not a fair one.
It's interesting because when we started the conversation, we talked a little bit about Sheryl Sandberg and the advice she gives to women, professional women. Do you think for working women, sort of lower skilled working women, that there are things that they can do outside of government to advance themselves, to make it easier for themselves, to maybe come out of this area? Yeah.
And Sabrina, you make it's a very good question, and I think and it does make me want to say that Sheryl Sandberg was right in this area. Women are actually doing a lot to remedy the situation, and you've seen the rise of a lot of these worker centers. A lot of them are about women and run by women. The National Domestic Workers Association, and they've done quite a bit to organize women who can't be organized. They're not protected by the National Labor Relations Act, so they can't create a union. But they've come together in other ways. It's moral support. They share information. They provide skills training for each other and connections. And I actually had the immense honor of being invited to a meeting of a group of domestic workers at CASA of Maryland. And it was just an incredibly interesting conversation, because they came together on weekends to share these kinds of stories. What is your experience in the workplace? If someone, and there's a common, or I should say at least two common experience of domestic workers of being subject to sexual harassment. So they share stories. They try and help each other get into new situations if they're in a bad if they're working for a bad employer. But they also, these were women who had gone to Annapolis to lobby for a minimum wage increase. And even though they weren't protected by the minimum wage, they were sort of engaging. And so what was really interesting to me is how these worker centers, they can't be like a union, so they do actually something totally different. They talk about working conditions, they talk about wages, but they also are a moral support for each other. They are organizing weekend activities, soccer matches, and all sorts of things. But they have language training, they have help with legal matters. Right. And, so I do think there's a lot going on that made me very hopeful. Okay. But it's a completely new phenomenon, and we'll have to see how it can be scaled and whether it's going to be able to have a broad impact.
And some of this, I suspect, will also have to do with the larger conversation we have, right? We want to make sure that the more people who recognize that the person cleaning your home or helping your elderly parent is a person who has a family, you want people to treat them with a sense of respect and hope that more people will think in those terms. I'm happy to hear you say something positive, because one thing, it's hard not to look at the title of this book, Under the Bus, how working women are being run over, and I thought, gosh, it's a little bit of a downer. And I also thought, does it sort of feed into this perspective that this woman is victim narrative, that life in America is hostile toward women, that the workplace discriminates against women, that we really don't have very many opportunities? Does it perpetuate that negative image of America, or do you think there is something more positive in here for readers?
Well, I do want to say that I do think the 20th century and the 21st century up till now has been progress for women. As I say in the book, certainly when you look at the set of laws that passed in the New Deal and beyond, we're talking the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the Social Security Act, and Medicare, and the Family and Medical Leave Act, and Title VII, and the Equal Pay Act, and on. We're actually looking at some significant steps forward that are reflected in where women are in the workplace, and women have seen some wage increases. But I think we can do better. And so my positive is that I think this is a great country. I think we can do better.
Yeah, that there's more for all of us to talk about, and there's more that employers can do. One thing that we think about with, again, not to jump from the working women to sort of the professional women, but we do talk a lot about technology. Do you think that there's a place for technology in terms of helping low-skilled workers, that making things easier for them?
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that's happened is that there's very sophisticated technology now around scheduling. Right. And I think, unfortunately, it's not been used so much to help workers as to be very much on the employer side, which is understandable. They developed the software, and they're trying to maximize profits. But what I think it can be seen as a win-win if employees can be given more notice about the way that the schedules will play out. I think you can still have a fair amount of give and take in ebb and flow of customer demand, and to give the employer some ability to be responsive to the economy at any given time, but also giving the employee more notice. So I think certainly the technology, if it's looked at it more holistically, is, how do we actually benefit more workers? I do think, things like telecommuting for certain kinds of workers, obviously doesn't work for everyone. Right.
But at no level. I mean, if you're a surgeon, you have to be in the operating room.
Exactly. So, but I think, it's certainly something that we should try and think about. How is it that we can optimize the advances that we've made in technology to make it so that low-skilled workers get more skills, that they have access to more jobs? I certainly think that can we figure out how to connect workers with jobs in a better way? That's always been a problem with the labor market, which leads to disagreements among economists. But I think a lot of labor economists recognize that the labor market is very broken in that employees don't necessarily know. Even if there is this job, it's in Florida and they're in Wyoming, how do you match that up? And so I think technology is a real opportunity to help correct some of those problems.
Well, that's fantastic. It's nice to be thinking, how things will change in the future. We have a few minutes left, so I would love, if you don't mind, to sort of put this in the context of the political landscape today. We have an election coming up. Seems sooner all of a sudden. It's still 2 years away, but we have a presidential election.
Have you declared yet?
I know. Yeah, probably not. So where do you see Under the Bus fitting into the conversation about women and women voters and women candidates in 2016?
Well, as I've been very pleased to see how much a lot of the topics that I write about are actually part of the national conversation, from the minimum wage to childcare to paid leave to sick leave. These are issues that are now being debated in the public arena.
Yes.
President Obama has been speaking broadly about the need to move forward on these policies. So I think it's actually a time where some of the ideas that you said, was rather, I can't remember the word, not provocative.
Yeah.
They're not so provocative. I think these are the policy proposals that I make are very much in the mainstream. I think they are being debated more and more. There are more and more members of Congress who are interested in or are already supporting legislation that addresses the issues that I raised. So I'm actually very hopeful that we have made some strides forward.
And do you think that we need to have a woman candidate to talk about these issues? I mean, there's, of course, I think more of these kind of policies would come from Democrats than Republicans. They may have a different approach to dealing with these, but at the same time, do you think you need a Hillary Clinton to tackle this, or are there other Democrats who you think are really on board with these ideas?
No, I don't. The Family Medical Leave Act was passed by, was signed by President Clinton, and Senator Chris Dodd was one of the lead proponents. I certainly hope it doesn't have to be a woman. Although I'm happy to have a woman, I think it would be wonderful to see a woman president, whoever she may be, whether it's Carly Fiorina or Hillary Clinton. I think it would be tremendous for our country to have that make that forward movement. Right. But no, I think men are part of families, and men, either if they don't have a wife, they have a mother or maybe a sister.
Yes.
I know they have a mother, and they may have daughters, and I think the daughters are sometimes the most forceful proponents, or the most forceful, symbol of why we need to move forward. So I'm actually, again, I'm hopeful, and I think there have been plenty of advances that have been that have helped women that have been put forward by men. And sometimes, as you mentioned earlier in my book, I advocate more universal solutions. I think a lot of the proposals are actually at least as helpful for men as they are for women. And I think there are many more men who recognize that we don't live anymore in a society, which the New Deal legislation structured the workplace around men working all week in a well-paying job, maybe in a factory, maybe somewhere else, able to afford not having a second income.
Exactly, right.
The wife was able to stay home and raise the kids. That's just not the world that we live in anymore. No. And so I think many more men are feeling just as kind of time pressured and constrained and want time with their kids, and now they're working too many hours and not making enough money, and if their wife is working, they're juggling who's picking up the kids. And so I think there are a lot of issues that are deeply resonant for men in our society. And so I think a man just as well as a woman can be the leader. And I would say recently, one of the things that I found gave me some hope was some of the activism around the recent Supreme Court case, the Lopez case, which was dealing with the Pregnancy Discrimination Act.
Right.
You had women's groups and some of the Christian right-wing groups coming together around needing to protect pregnant women in the workplace. Right. Not, women who are pregnant should not be discriminated against. It's just, for whatever reason, because you think that they have every right to work, whether you don't want to encourage them not to get pregnant, to have an abortion, or whatever the reasons. And but I thought that, that people can come together across, a spectrum and realize that we need to address these issues because pregnant women are going to be working, and they're either going to go through their pregnancy or they're going to terminate their pregnancy.
Right.
And if we want them to be able to continue, we want these women to be able to continue their pregnancy, we need to make sure they don't get discriminated against in the workplace.
Well, I actually love it's called Leaning Together, and Independent Women's Forum also put out a book this year called Lean Together. And I think, so I actually was sort of, I liked that title of your chapter, and I was thinking, you were talking more about sort of how we can lean together to create good policies. But there's also the issue of how can we work together as Democrats and Republicans. Unfortunately, it's a rather partisan environment these days. Do you think that partisanship can be overcome? Because it sounds like there are ways, and we're seeing that sometimes politics makes for strange bedfellows, but are there other ways that we can maybe compromise on some of this? Because, of course, there are going to be conservatives who say this is too much government, but we all want to help those people who are in need.
Well, child care may be a good example. And, I personally, think that government programs can be effective and can often be both effective but also cost effective. But, it doesn't mean that has to be the solution. If there are private solutions that would be accessible, I think that is fine. What we need quality and affordability and accessibility. So we need parents to be able to get their kids into those programs. They need to make sure they're not in some unsafe facility with an unskilled caregiver. And we need to make sure that they're affordable. And so I think there are any number of ways you can come at that, and I think there are quite a lot of conservatives that would recognize that is a very important value, and that children who are left in self-care, which I just could not get over that term. It's just not good for our country.
No, I think, and I do think that America is a country that is extremely giving, extremely charitable, that we don't want to turn our backs on those in need. So hopefully we can come to some agreement on how best to help, especially working women. Any final thoughts on the book, things that you would love to leave listeners with, so that when they pick up their copy of Under the Bus, things they might be thinking about and looking for?
Well, one of the things that sort of I discovered through this is my own family history. And I think my great-grandmother came from Sweden, and she was very poor, and she left her father. He basically sent her away because he couldn't afford to have her anymore, and she'd been taking care of her younger siblings because her mother had died. They all died, all of her siblings. So at that point, I think her widowed father basically put her on the boat. She came to the United States, and she, was able to make it. But she worked as a domestic worker. She was, she was a scullery maid, and really made me think about, Downton Abbey and upstairs, downstairs, and in her life. But I think it sort of made me realize how many Americans have that somewhere.
Yes.
And I think if we sort of think about, what made it possible for someone in my family to be, to make it where we are now.
Right.
And it was just very eye-opening to think about that what my great-grandmother faced is still what domestic workers face. Her legal situation is the same situation they face now, so no legal protections. So it was just, for me, very, very important to unearth some of that history and to understand that, my family too has had these stories.
Right. No, that's so interesting. And everybody, of course, in America at some point was an immigrant here. So, of course, everybody has something like that to fall back on. And I wonder, or I should say, I hope that while maybe legally there may be room for improvements, that culturally things have shifted. I mean, I like to think that, with women make up almost 50% of the workforce. I think the largest number of women workers are now in managerial positions. Do we see a positive future for women workers in America?
No, I do. I think we do see it. There's got to be. Women are working.
Right.
I think as a society we're grappling with it, and we're moving slowly in the right direction.
Right.
But yes, I think so.
Well, that's very good, because I still feel very optimistic about the future of the United States and opportunities for women and girls. Final thoughts, if you had to tell a young girl today who maybe doesn't have all the educational or financial opportunities ahead of her that maybe you and I have benefited from, what would you recommend? What would you say that she can do to make things better for herself?
Well, that's a hard question. But I think having an open mind as to what kinds of jobs you're going to try and pursue. Because as we talked about before, women's professions still are paid categorically less than male professions, even with the same skills and experience. And so, if you can sort of think about going into one of those fields that are dominated by men, you're going to have a chance to make a higher salary. So I'd say that's something to think about.
Think about it. Well, I found this to be a fascinating book. Whether you agree or disagree with some of the solutions, I think it starts a really important conversation about working women in America, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
I did as well. Thank you,
good.
Sabrina.
Thank you. Obviously, you have a legal and policy background. You're familiar with the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Family and Medical Leave Act, but the premise seems to be that none of these laws really go far enough, that we simply need more government to help women, especially those who are lower on the economic scale. Do you want to sort of share more about that?
Well, sure. Sabrina, I think there are two pieces to it. One is that we simply don't have responses to some very broad questions. And these aren't just for low-wage women, although they're particularly important for them. But, for example, we don't actually have a child care system in this country. We have some Band-Aids. We have some subsidized programs that are very under-resourced. Only 18% of eligible children are actually able to get in to the government-subsidized programs. But then middle-class families struggle very deeply with the costs of child care. And you hear that child care, actual quality child care, can cost as much as tuition at a university. So, we have that is really out of whack. But then, what was really interesting and somewhat troubling to me, coming out of a background of policy and law, was that as I sort of started looking into some of the laws that I've found and believed to be very important, and still do, that they had some real gaps in there. And as I looked into them and looked into the history, I realized, and that's sort of where this title comes from, that in the deal-making process, there were categories of workers, and a lot of them were women and women of color, who got thrown under the bus. And so they were cut out, or explicitly left out of our wage and hour laws, or who don't have the right to organize in a union, or who may not be covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act.
And then C-SPAN 2, and watch any of our past programs online at booktv.org. Book TV continues now with Caroline Fredrickson. The author of Under the Bus discusses the impact of labor and employment laws on working women and their families on our Afterwards program.
Well, hi, Caroline Fredrickson. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to talk about your new book, Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over. It is a pretty bold thesis, a pretty provocative title. So I think we'll just jump right into it, and I'll give you a minute to tell us what you mean by this.
Great, sure. Sabrina, well, first let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here with you and on C-SPAN. So the book, it came out of I guess my disappointment, really, with some of the dialogue that occurred after Sheryl Sandberg published her book, Lean In, which I think says some important things. But there are a lot of things that weren't said that really are what affect the vast majority of women, for whom leaning in isn't really, an available option. Their challenges are much more existential. And so what I wanted to do was expose some of the broader questions that are affecting women in the workforce, and think about what are the possible solutions that we as a nation could be moving towards.
Right. Well, yeah, I was going to say that it did seem like part of your frustration was simply about the conversation around working women and which working women we're talking about. So this book really focuses on women with less education who are sort of lower down on the socioeconomic ladder, are overtly eliminating them, or they're saying we don't need to worry about those women. I mean, are they really that bad? I mean,
well, honestly, not anymore. It doesn't play out that way. Now it's more inadvertent or questions of the costs. But at its origins, it was actually quite explicit. And when I was digging into some of the history around the New Deal, and when Congress adopted the flagship pieces of legislation, the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act, there's some very explicit conversations on the record coming from Southern, what we would call Dixiecrats, who reflected a very strong point of view about the Southern economy being dependent on the kind of agricultural farming that the farm economy that was dominant in the South, and they wanted to protect what they thought of as their way of life. And again, it's very explicit in talking about how important it is for us to keep, our traditions, and the black man, can't be paid the same as the white man because that's not what we do. And so you have these conversations on the record, and then you had actions that sort of, in terms of the implementation, where categories of workers who were, it was well known, were African American, and many of them were women. They were the domestic workers and the farm workers, and a lot of the farm laborers were women as well. And they were cut out as in a concession to, and these are, I think we don't look enough at the gaps and think about what the impact is. And so, I started thinking about, as I got deeper into this issue and started thinking about the domestic workers who basically have no legal protections in the workplace. And I started wondering, well, so for a nanny who doesn't get paid or is not at least guaranteed a minimum wage or overtime, isn't protected against discrimination, certainly can't join a union. What happens when the nanny has a sick kid? What goes on in that situation? And so it was questions like that I wanted to explore. What is the child care situation for someone in that category? And as I looked more and more into it, as I said, I got into all these other issues of family leave and child care, and discovered somewhat, even more to my dismay, that the Department of Labor does surveys of the kind of care that children are in. They actually have a category that is quite large. It's called self-care. And those are the kids who are just left. They're just left by themselves. And I think that, for me, even if you don't, no matter what your perspective is on working women or, whether or not we need a strong government role in providing a fair workplace, the fact that we have a large group of children who are growing up without supervision, I think, is an economic issue for all of us, because the consequences of that are lasting.
Well, one of the things that you have right in the book jacket, actually, is that a lot of these women, as you see it, and then we'll get into the policies, the specific policies in a minute, but that they're sort of really systematically left out. Do you think that policymakers...
The Dixiecrats, who wanted to preserve their economy as well as the dominance of the white majority down there.
Right, and certainly I think we'd both agree that 80-plus years later, hopefully things have evolved, in many ways, in many good ways. But at the same time, you, of course, point very quickly in the book to the pay gap. The idea that women are still only paid, or I should say white women are still only paid 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. Now, and it's funny because this conversation happens all the time. We just had Equal Pay Day here in Washington, sort of the date that lots of women's groups say marks the amount of time extra that women would have to work to make up for those lost wages. But at the same time, we're seeing that more and more mainstream and even left-leaning outlets are questioning this number, right? That we're saying, okay, there is a wage gap, but it's not quite as large. Do you think it's fair to keep using this number? Should we be using a different number? Are we able to convince people that we need policy if we use a smaller number? Is that the problem?
Well, I do think it's a fair number, but I would agree with those who are critical who'd say it's not all a reflection of discrimination. Okay. At least explicit, direct discrimination.
And social.
So, economists, say there's somewhere between around a 20% pay gap. About 49, 50% of that is attributable to occupational segregation. And I think we could have an argument about whether that is a choice or whether there are cultural constraints or it's difficult for women to break into different professions. But it is a fact.
Tell viewers what you mean by that, because some people refer to it as the pink ghetto, others probably